Bread is important to all Western cultures, but it was extremely important 200 and 300 years ago, specifically to the poor. Bread is what poor people survived upon, whether they were in the country or in the city. There are several times in the 18th century there are crop failures and the wheat is so very, very expensive that bread doubles and triples in price. That becomes almost impossible for poor people to have their mainstay of food. So if bread doubles or triples in price and the poor survive on bread, what do? What do they use as that substitute for wheat bread? This really isn't a problem for the rich or the middle class. They will always be able to get wheat. Maybe it'll be expensive imported wheat, but wheat is available. They can afford it. At the very end of the 18th century, the British government saw the problem with this. They started doing research on what were the substitutes for wheat when you're making bread. They did all these tests, and there was a great book printed in the early 19th century, 1804, that talked about the art of bread making. And in that, they laid out all the substitutes for wheat. And we get an idea here about what they were using for substitutes. Sometimes they're new substitutes, but the vast majority of them were things that have been used for hundreds of years as substitutes for wheat whenever it got expensive. The research lays out the different substitutes and what they cost. Some of these substitutes weren't any better than wheat. They were just as expensive. Rice is a wonderful example of this. You can make rice bread, but in the 18th century, rice was almost as expensive as wheat, so there was no real reason to use it. Another one of these substitutes that seemed to be almost as expensive as wheat were white peas. And I'm not even sure exactly what they meant by white peas. Probably a type of kind of bean. I don't know exactly, but it was really expensive in the time period. Two of the least expensive were barley and oatmeal, and these were already a common substitute in the south of England and of course in the north of England and Scotland, where oatmeal was very, very popular. So that is what the poor had been subsisting upon all this time. They rarely ate wheat bread anyway. One of the grains that's mentioned are beans, and that's what I want to focus on today, bean bread. Or even in the time period, sometimes something called horse bread. And horse bread is very interesting. It's been made for hundreds of years, even in the 18th century, and it was made to feed horses. Whether you are going on a trip and you don't know whether there'll be fodder along and you need to be able to carry your food, it's hard to carry a whole lot of hay with you if you're taking a horse, but you can take horse bread. So they would feed specialized horse bread to race horses, to work horses, horses that are sick, or they'd use them in circumstances where they didn't have the proper fodder. Horse bread was not quite like bread that we think of today, but it was made by the baker. In fact, in some places in Great Britain, it was illegal for anybody but the baker to make horse bread. And horse bread was made with ground beans, peas, sometimes something like oats or barley, and probably no wheat. And they would use a very coarse grind. They wouldn't bother to put anything like yeast in it, and they would make these hard, dense cakes of bread just for horses. When wheat became expensive, then poor people who couldn't afford anything else, would have to eat horse bread. Using beans as a substitute for wheat seems like it would be pretty easy for bread, but it's not easy. Wheat you just grind up into flour and you mix it with your water and your yeast and a little bit of salt and ta-da, you've got bread. But beans ground up don't work very well. In fact, some beans even have a kind of toxicity to them. So unless they're soaked or cooked in a certain way, they're not good for you. Beans ground up just as they are generally kind of have a bitter taste, and they don't make anything that's very palatable, at least for humans. Apparently horses didn't mind that much, so that for horse bread, they would just grind up the beans and toss it right in. But for people, if people want to eat a bean bread, then you have to kind of work on those beans. They have to be soaked, but you can't soak the beans and then grind them into a flour. That wouldn't work very well. You'd have to let them completely dry out again. So the directions that we get in the 18th century are to grind the bean into a fine flour and then soak that flour. Now, that's hard to do. If you just add a little bit of water to the bean flour, you make a paste, And you can't switch the water on it. It does not work, because what we want to do is change the water a couple of different times, and that'll take the bitterness away. Now, they were very familiar with this kind of a technique. They would use it on things like salt beef and salt pork to wash away the salt. So soaking bean flour can be tricky. We have to have a lot of water. And we just stir it a little bit and let that settle very rapidly, and then pour that off once or twice. The directions in our book in 1804 talk about putting our beans to soak for 3 days, changing the water each day. And then you have this sodden bean flour that you can put into your flour mix and make a bread that's 50-50 bean flour and wheat flour. There are a lot of different kinds of beans that are listed in the 18th century, and we could use something like the fava bean or a field pea, which is a kind of bean. We've got white beans and red beans, cranberry beans, all these kinds of beans. None of those were specifically separated out in our recipe, so we can try some of those different ones to see if some have a more bitter flavor than others. I picked a bean that's giving us the whitest flour. Some of these cranberry beans and other beans have a darkness from the shell of the bean, but I've picked a yellow bean and a white bean, kind of mixed them together to give us a white bean flour. Right out of the mill, the bean flour looks good. It's got a good color to it. It's a little yellowy looking, but you know, it looks like your standard run-of-the-mill flour. But it's definitely got a strange raw bean smell to it, and I'm sure the taste would be very off. You could instantly tell this was nothing like a wheat flour, and if I made bread with this just as it was, it would probably just be clammy and have just a very strange, almost metallic taste to it. I'm working from the Art of Bread Making book in 1804, and it has a recipe for mixed bean bread. So we're going to start off with whole wheat flour and mix that with a little bit of salt and a little bit of barm here. And it's going to be a very, very dry mixture. But I've already got my bean flour that's been soaked. This has been soaking for 3 days, and I've taken the water off each day. And what I'm left with is a very, very heavy slurry that we're going to add into our flour, and that will probably bring along all the moisture we're going to need. In fact, maybe just a little bit more than we need. And we'll mix that in with our wheat flour, and it will end up being about 50-50 bean flour and wheat flour, along with that salt and our barm, which is the yeast. And we've talked about barm in other recipes. That has to do with the yeast that comes off the top of a brewing batch of beer that you get from the brewer. In fact, it's better if you get ale, because then you don't have that bitterness of beer. If you're doing this in a modern context, standard packets of yeast that you get at the grocery store will work just fine. Once this is mixed well, we can go ahead and set this aside and let the yeast work. These substitutes have been going on for hundreds of years, whether it's the Scots with oatmeal or the south of Great Britain with barley, and more classically in North America, corn, or as in the book it's called maize. So corn in North America is what everybody's eating for bread. Sometimes they'll have a bread that does have a mix. So they'll mix it with rye and they'll mix it with wheat to make a high-class bread that still has corn in it. Very few people, especially in that middle and lower class here in North America in the 18th century, are eating wheaten bread. That is a special bread and not eaten that often. Most people are eating cornbread. Our bread was in the oven about 30 minutes or so at 400. It was in the earthen oven, so it kind of started high and worked a little low. It did not rise a lot. I don't know whether it was because of the beans or because my barm wasn't as active as I needed it to be, but that's all right. This is probably exactly like a loaf was like 200 or 300 years ago as they're making bean bread. And it's interesting as we dig in that they were looking for solutions to this problem of not having enough wheat in 1804. But they had been having those problems for 200-300 years before that, and the solutions were there. People were making bread with other kinds of grains. This is one of those examples. So let's find out what this tastes like. That's the important part. And now, the smell, great, wonderful whole wheat loaf smell. But the taste is like a whole wheat loaf, but you can definitely tell there's some bean in there, maybe a little bean bitterness. Regardless, This is bread. This you can survive on. Those poor people in the 18th century, they might have had to survive on this, and it would get them through the day. It would fill their bellies. This is the solution to the problem of very expensive wheat.